passage tonight, a very important book. Not that any of the books are not important, but this book of Ezekiel that we're going to be in, you can turn to chapter 47. I'm going to spend a little bit of time setting a foundation for you to understand what happens in the first 46 chapters. It's an extensive amount. If you know the Old Testament, you know the weaving in and out of the books. And so some of what we're studying tonight was exactly what was going on when we were dealing with Haggai. And you're going to see some familiar names in the passages, and certainly I will point out those so that you can see the tie-in. Because it's very cool to know that God had multiple prophets addressing the same issues to the entire Israelite nation. And that just tells you how big our God can be, that He will put on the minds of many what His plan is. The name for tonight, if you want to take notes, is Jehovah. You've written Jehovah down a number of times, but the second word is Shammah. S-H-E-M-M-A-H is the transliteration of it. Jehovah-Shammah, and it means the Lord is there. I told you a little bit of that this morning, but Jehovah-Shammah, the Lord is there. In chapter 40 of Ezekiel, Ezekiel had a vision. And that vision, the time was around 574 BC, and they were in the 25th year of the exile. It was 14 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. So imagine this time. Jerusalem was completely sacked. It was destroyed. The people had been taken captive out of there. All the young men who were in that area of Jerusalem were taken captive and taken back as slaves into Babylon. There were guys, one of the Bible figures you would know is the person of Daniel, who was taken in one of the plunderings of the people. And so the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were in trouble. This is about the time when the division came between the northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel was overrun by the Assyrians in 723 BC. And you don't hear much about the northern kingdom after that, by that title or that name. But Judah was invaded and taken by Babylon, and that's where Daniel and those folks were taken captive. And over a period of time, the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was coming down and continuing to take people. So it wasn't just one time. In fact, 3 different times, the captives were taken out of this area. The buildings were completely destroyed, and of course, the crown jewel of the city was the temple, and it was completely ransacked. It was beaten and torn down so badly that not 2 stones were left together. It was an intentional affront against the Lord. Ezekiel was taken captive in an invasion around 607 BC. And 10 years later, in 587, Nebuchadnezzar came down again and this time destroyed that town completely. The people of Judah remained in slavery in Babylon for about 40 years, which is interesting. 40 years, can you imagine living in captivity with not being able to have any of your own freedoms and your own rights? So this is a situation that we find ourselves in when Ezekiel receives a call. One of the characters that we read in the book of Haggai is a person by the name of Zerubbabel. He was a son of Shealtiel, and if you'll remember that name, Zerubbabel is one that Haggai addressed quite often. Later you'll see another person named Nehemiah who comes along, and he decides that since Zerubbabel and his people are building the temple, we're going to build the walls back up. Because as you know, this captivity after 40 years begins to loosen, and waves of the Israelite nation are sent back. And so Ezekiel was one of the first to be sent back with some of the people, and it is Ezekiel that we're discussing tonight. So in chapter 47 of the book of Ezekiel, I want you to turn there to verse 1. Now at the time of this story starting, this is the vision we'll be reading tonight. At the time of this story starting, the city is still called Jerusalem, although it's been destroyed. But you're going to see at the end of chapter 48 in Ezekiel that the Lord pronounces through his prophet Ezekiel an entirely different name. He says, no longer will the city be known as Jerusalem, a city of peace, but now the city will be called Jehovah-Shammah, which means the Lord is there. And there's a reason for this. The Lord is there. So why don't you stand with me as we read through the first 12 verses of chapter 47. Remember that this is a vision that God has given Ezekiel on their preparation and their return to the Jerusalem area where everything is destroyed. Then he brought me back to the door of the house, and behold, water was flowing from under the threshold of the house toward the east. For the house faced east, and the water was flowing down from under, from the right side of the house, from the south of the altar. He brought me out by way of the north gate and led me around on the outside to the outer gate by way of the gate that faces east. And behold, water was trickling from the south side. When the man went out towards the east with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits. And he led me through the water, and water reaching the ankles. Again he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, and water reaching the knees. And again he measured 1,000 and led me through the water, water reaching the loins. And again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not ford. For the water had risen enough to swim in, a river that could not be forded. Verse 6 says, he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? And then he brought me back to the bank of the river. Now when I had returned, behold, on the bank of the river there were many trees, and on one side and on the other. And then he said to me, these waters go out toward the eastern region and go down into the Arabah. And then they go toward the sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea become fresh. It will come about that every living creature which swarms in every place where the river goes will live. And there will be very many fish. For those waters go there, and the others become fresh. So everything will live where the river goes. And it will come about that the fishermen will stand beside it. From the Engadi into the Eneglaim, there will be a place for spreading nets. Their fish will be according to their kind, like the fish of the great sea, very many. But its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They will be left for salt. By the river on its banks, and on one side and on the other will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, and their fruit will not fail. They will bear every month, because their water flows from the sanctuary, and their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. You may be seated. It's an amazing passage. If you were to do a study of how many times the Bible uses flowing water as an illustration of the power of God, you might be very amazed. You might be amazed. In the Old Testament, the temple that was destroyed was a place where God lived, where he dwelled among his people. And so in understanding that, you see the reason for the vision. The people probably, in the time of Ezekiel, had given up hope on God ever doing anything for them. They probably were saying things like, well, you know, God may have helped out our ancestors, but he don't care nothing about us. Or they might have said things that you might hear today like, well, God may care for some people, but I'm not one of those. If God truly was a God of love, he would have saved my great-grandma, or he would have saved my very best friend. If God were the kind of God that I wanted to follow, God would never have let his temple, the place where he dwelt among us, be destroyed. These are things that might have been said during that time, because they're things we hear today. When the lack of the presence of the idea of God even exists, there's trouble. And so God sees in his prophet a need to reveal himself once again to the people who he loves. And so he tells Ezekiel this prophecy of the coming temple. And you see there's no temple there. But here you see in this passage, and we're going to go back over it. But I wanted to share with you an illustration. I did not know this, but the Niagara Falls, and how many of you have been to Niagara Falls? Okay, good number of you. You know the power that the water flows over the falls. And you know in times past it had bridges that you could walk across. Now I don't think for safety's sake they don't have that anymore. But they used to have a bridge, and I found it interesting how they built the first bridge that people could walk across the falls on. Because, you know, they didn't have a cannon or anything they could shoot the rope across. They certainly didn't have barges back then strong enough to hand down cable and then lift it back up to the side. It was all manpower when this first one was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. What they did was they took a small string and they flew a kite across the falls, and then the kite fell down to the side. They cut the string off the kite, they tied to the other end across the falls a little bit bigger piece of rope and pulled it across. And then they did the same over and over and over again until they had a strong enough rope to make one side of the bridge and then the other. Interesting way. But what I hear from that and what I see in that is determination will always find a way, always find a means. And our God is determined. His promise is true. In fact, in the new year, we're going to be studying 12 promises. I broke them up into 12 different studies. Promises that we can trust God to fulfill. But we know one of the promises was He would not let His people perish. That He would offer and bring them freedom. He would give them hope where hope did not exist. He would be the peace giver of His people. We know the names of God that we have studied, that all promise Him, I'll be the banner bearer for you, my people. I will do this and I will do that. All these promises we have, and here we are, in the time when they needed Him most. So He calls Ezekiel and He tells him this story. I know that thing right there would have been bad for y'all. The temple is a source of waters parallel to the Father as a source of salvation. We see that where? John chapter 4, the woman at the well, you hear you hunger or you thirst for this water, but I'm going to give you a water that you won't thirst for anymore. It'll be perfect water. It'll be like fountains flowing up. We see that passage. In 2 Samuel 5:8, David entered the city by coming through a water shaft. I don't know if anybody remembers that story. Solomon was anointed in the spring at Gihon. The spring Gihon was connected by Hezekiah to the pool of Siloam in 2 Kings 2:20. That same pool, if you remember from a New Testament story, was the one where he was laid by his friends on a mat, crippled, hoping that an angel would come and stir the water up. That same pool. Over and over in Scripture you see water as a source of salvation for mankind. And it's no different in the book of Ezekiel. When you see this water flowing out of the temple in the vision that Ezekiel saw, you're going to see very clearly. Let's look at the first two verses again in Ezekiel chapter 47. I want to point out that there was a source to the river. If we're talking about the river, then I want to point out the source of the river. So verse 1 says, Then He brought me back. Who's He? The angel of the Lord. The same one that appeared in Ezekiel 40. Go back and read that on your own. We don't have time to go any deeper into this story than I am today. But in Ezekiel 40, we see the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord, I believe here, is a Christophany, which means that we have an appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament among the people. So He brought me back to the door of the house. Why do I think that? I don't want to get too deep here. But we don't see gender with the angels very often in Scriptures, right? We see a little, but it's language-wise it's different. But here we see a He, and it's a very clear reference to, I think, the person of Jesus. And so then He brought me back to the door of the house, and behold, water was flowing under the threshold of the house toward the east. Why towards the east? Because when they were in captivity before, the east was where things were, where Jerusalem was. And so it was east that pointed back to who God was. And so when they lost their way, they always prayed to the east. They still, by the way, pray to the east today. I thought that was interesting. But the water's flowing to the east, and for the house faced the east, and the water was flowing down from under the right side of the house, from the south of the altar. The angel took Ezekiel to the very source of the water. That source was found in the temple of the Lord, and the source is the living water that flows. Very interesting. I want to jump real quick into verses 3 through 5 because we're going to get into a little bit here. that we've studied before. But in verses 3 through 5, we didn't just see the source of the river, that it was coming from the temple under the threshold, but we see the course of the river, which direction it's going. In verse 3, it says, when the man went out toward the east with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he led me through the water reaching the ankles. Now, you know, if you're going out into an unknown river, if you're going out into the unknown of any type, then it's not a dangerous river if it's just at your ankles, right? I mean, you're not real scared if you go to the ocean and you see waves breaking over your ankles. You're not going to be terrified of that because you know that you have the strength to endure that kind of water or that kind of force. And so we see the first 1,000 cubits out into this flowing water that represents the source of God was not scary for Ezekiel in his dream. He went out there into the source, into the level of his ankles. Verse 3, finishing up, it says, and he led me through the water reaching the ankles. Again, in verse 4, it says, he measured 1,000 more cubits, or he measured 1,000 and led me through the water reaching the knees. Now, if you've ever been in a flood or any type of wash, we used to live out in California, you would have those desert rains that would come down, not even really that hard, but because the ground was so hard-packed, you would have, what do they call that? When the water comes rushing through a flash flood. Thank you very much. You'd have a flash flood, and if it broke at your knees, you could handle it. You could stand up. You might actually have to brace a little bit, but it wasn't overwhelming. So the things that were coming at you, the things that you were being expected to handle, you could still do it. But at your knees, it's starting to get a little bit noticeable. Verse 4 goes beyond and says, again, he measured 1,000 more and led me through the water reaching the lowings. And in verse 5, it says, again, he measured 1,000. It was a river that I could not ford. You ever heard the term, who in here has heard the term deep water Baptist? Deep water Baptist. I believe that comes from this passage. And it's those, when someone would refer to a deep water Baptist, it'd be someone that would be willing to go out beyond the safety net of their own faith and trust in the Lord. And this is what this is about. You see, you understand that when you go and you follow Jesus, at first he's going just to call you to him. And that's kind of ankle deep. We're getting a relationship started with him. And most people hear and see that, they go, I kind of get that. But there's going to come a time when God asks you to do something that seems a little scary. But you're going to go, you know what, as a Christian, I trust him with my ankles, and I'm going to trust him at the knees. I'm going to trust him to do this thing that's a little bit deeper. For me, that was VBS. My first VBS. They asked me if I'd work with the students. And I had just been teaching on a Wednesday night with the youth for a few weeks. And I said, sure, I'll help out. And then they said, will you do the Bible studies each night? And I'm like, that's not helping, that's running. But I guess I don't have a choice because I know God's telling me to work with the students and they have needs, they have tons of needs. And so I went out there to do that. And so I started studying the lessons they gave, and it was scary. Well, then we see in this passage I just read to you that it wasn't enough at the knees, that we went out farther and it came up to the hips, or the midsection, the loins, the Bible calls it. But out there, now, it's pretty treacherous. You know when the water's flowing real fast in a river or something, and you get waist deep, you're getting to a point where it can push you away no matter how hard you struggle. And you realize for the first time, maybe, that you are not under your own control or your own power any longer. How many have ever felt like that in church? That you were out there so far that only God could save you. That you've extended yourself so far that only God could save you. You see, that's how it's been for me. Is just trusting him in places where I know I could not go on my own. I could not stand in the waist deep. I could not go out in those places. But because of the power of God and him taking me out there, I know, and Peter recognized this, right? There was a time when Peter got a little bit deeper than waist deep. When he stepped out of the boat to walk to Jesus on the water. And then he realized what he had done. And he decided to himself that this wasn't a great way. So he started to look away from the Lord. What happens to him? He sinks. But who was there to rescue him? Jesus. If we would remember as Christians that the Lord has not put us out in the middle of this rushing current of life or this rushing call of ministry and left us out there, if we would just remember that the Lord is there, would we not have a stronger comfort and trust in who He is? The problem is we forget that the Lord is not, or that He is there. We think He's not there. He's with someone else. Or He's blessed others, but not me that way. Ezekiel pointed out the water was flowing at the point where he entered it, ankle, waist. You notice the last progression is a place where there is no longer footing for man. There's no longer footing. It says in there, if we can go right back to the verse, and it risen enough water to swim in, a river that could not be forded, could not walk across it any longer. You could swim in it, but you could not walk across it anymore. He had taken me to a place where I was fully trusting in Him. And do you know that's the place where God wants us tonight? It's not in the ankle water. It's not in the knee-deep water. When I can still recall or think to myself that I might be able to handle what's going on, I am not in the place where God wants me. When He had Ezekiel out there, Ezekiel had a message. He had to go back and tell the people of Israel, God is going to rebuild the temple better than it ever was. He's going to rebuild your city. Not only is He going to rebuild the temple and rebuild the city, but you're going to have finer homes and you're going to have a better relationship with Him. And everything you've ever known is going to be different. And then along is going to come a person named Jesus, and He's going to die for each of your sins. And you're not going to need the priest any longer. But all these things are going to happen to you. Do you not know that Ezekiel had to be confident of the message he was going to take to the people? Because if he didn't buy into it, who would in the hearing group? No one. And so God was convincing Ezekiel to trust Him, to go to a place where he no longer could claim any of his survival or any of his power. And that's what we see in this passage. And so then we move on to the next set of verses. That in verse 6, we're going to start with the force of the river. How powerful was this river? He said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? And then He brought me back to the bank of the river. Now God had taken him out into the deep place, taken him out to a place where he was totally reliant on God. But do you notice also, probably at a point when he was swimming, he realized he was tired, or you could get tired in your ministry. God will always take you to a place where you can rest. That doesn't mean you'll stay at a restful place. That doesn't mean that you've done your one job for God and now you can just wait on Him to call you home. That just means that He's going to provide your needs. And after being out there in that deep water, swimming in this vision, he would have needed a bit of rest. It takes him to the side in verse 6. It says, Then He brought me back to the bank of the river. Now when I had returned, behold, on the bank of the river there were very many trees on one side and on the other. Then He said to me, These waters go out and toward the eastern region and go down into the Arabah, and then they go toward the sea. That sea, by the way, is the Dead Sea, so full of minerals that no living creature can survive in it. And that's the way we know that sea to be today. And so now, here's the interesting thing. When the living water that Jesus Christ provides you begins to flow out of you, and it goes past those things which have long since been dead, by the power of Jesus Christ in your life, dead things will come to life. Listen to the verses here again, verse 8. Then He said to me, These waters go out in the eastern region, go into the Arabah, then they go toward the sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea become what? Fresh. They become fresh. You know what fresh water does? It oxygenates living creatures. Fish need oxygen. Those process that oxygen to their bodies, and they live. So when you go out and you're full of the Lord, that cup being full, as I spoke of this morning, and trusting in Christ Jesus to use you, you're going to be having received the living water of Christ Jesus, you're going to be part of the flow that goes out into the community and sees people transformed. Not because of any power of your own. Remember, we're in deep water here. But because of the transformative power of Jesus. How exciting is that? That God's going to be able to use you to bring life back to people through His message. That's exciting to me. And the temple had purpose, right? Because it was a place where they all kind of staged and they gathered to go out and do God's business. It's much like the church today. This is not, our business is not to get a community full of people here in this building. We're going to work to bring them back here because our fellowship starts here. Our friendships bond here. We're strengthened together. A lot of ministries happen in this place. But ultimately, God has called us not to do ministry in this building, but to find people, find sinners at the point of their need, and to share ministry of Jesus Christ with them. And when we do those things, when we find them at the point of their need, and we walk them towards Christ, what are we doing? Essentially the same as the angel did for Ezekiel. We're guiding them in their walk with the Lord. We're guiding them towards that flowing fresh water, that living water that saves through Jesus Christ. Now, going on in verse 9, it says, it will become that every living creature which swarms in every place where the river goes will live. So if that flowing, life-saving water, that good stuff, flows by them, they'll find life. Not just the fish. The Bible says the trees along the banks, because the water will be so plentiful, it will be so life-giving that the trees along the banks will thrive. Keep going. Become fresh, so everything that lives where the river goes. And it will become about, in verse 10, the fishermen will stand beside it, from Engadi into Englam, and there will be a place for the spreading of nets. The fish are going to live. Not just a few fish, but so many fish, a multitude of fish, to the point where the fishermen won't even have to work. They'll just stand on a bank, and they'll be able to cast a net, and they'll get all that they need. How cool a promise is that? And do you think if God promised those people then, and reminded them, by the way, of what He had done in the first exile, don't you think if it happened once, He promised it the second time? We know it happened the second time, the third time, the fourth time. If it's happened all those times, can we not hold it as truth that it will happen this time as well? Is God a God of consistency? Is He the God who doesn't change? If He is, then whatever trial you're walking through tonight, do you not know that His living water is going to flow into you and bring life in the situation you're in? I don't know what that life looks like. It doesn't mean that every one of our sick family members is going to make it. It's a treacherous world. The world's been lost to sin. God is calling people to Him. The Bible says in 2 Peter 3:9 that He's patient and long-suffering, not wanting anyone to perish. God isn't measured by His letting someone die. God is measured by the fact that none of us have the right to get there, and yet He still is long-suffering and giving all of us a chance to be saved. That is the definition, by the way, of good. That is the definition of gracious. And that is the definition of our God. Loving us in spite of our sin. Loving us to the point where He is continuing to seek to save us. How good is our God? And when we don't get it, sometimes He'll take us in a vision-like place and show us what He's going to do. We call that today ideas about God's church. Because often we're afraid to say, God's given me a vision. But I'm telling you, God's church thrives on vision. When there is no vision, what happens? The church perishes, people perish. And by the way, the New Testament, the church is the people, right? The part of the body of Christ. So the church will perish. Now, if this building burns down tomorrow, are we still a church? You bet. You bet. And God built us something different. They were getting a projector out of it. But I'm telling you this, God's got a big plan. I don't know all the answers. I know, though, this, when He begins to tell us, He's going to tell more than one of us. I didn't come here as a pastor to stand over you and say, this is what we're doing, and you all got to follow me. It's not my style of leadership. I want to see what God is talking to all of us about. I want to come together, and I want us to move. And when it comes time to move, I'll be the one to blow the whistle. Let's go. But I want to hear from you where God's taken us. And isn't He taking us in a great place? I don't know what it was like before I was here, but I've been in churches where no visitors come for months at a time. And there's not a week that goes by where we don't have visitors. And God is showing us that our visitors become our members very shortly. Something's going on. I don't know what it is, but I'll tell you this. If I were a crippled man laying at the pool and I was waiting for the water to be stirred, I think I'd be looking at that water right now. Because I think God is stirring the water. Or what my professor in seminary used to say, Richard Ross used to say, we're setting the sail for revival. I think it's time to hoist that puppy up. Time to get that sail set because God's bringing a mighty wind. He's going to blow through this town and He's going to do something. And I'm telling you, I'm going to be on that boat. I'm going to be on with Him, whatever God has planned. Because there is a mighty force behind the river that flows out of the temple. You see, the temple was a place where God was recognized as being with the people. But out of the temple flowed this water. Why? Because it wasn't just the temple people any longer that needed God. It wasn't just the Israelites any longer that needed God. What happens in the New Testament? Jesus becomes life-giving, not just to Israelites or to the Jews. He becomes life-giving to who? The Gentiles. The Bible says in the book of Romans that we're grafted into the Israelite nation by the power of Jesus Christ. He tasked some very powerful Jewish leaders of that time first to become Christians and then to take the message of Christ to the Gentiles because the Jews weren't ready for it. And I tell you tonight, God has a message for us to take to whomever is ready to receive it. How exciting is that when I've got 500 pieces of paper on my desk with names, phone numbers, and addresses that are just waiting to be reached out to. They came to us and said, here's my information. Knowing that we're a church, we're coming after them. I don't want to disappoint them. I don't want to let them down. So the Dead Sea was so full of death that only this living water could provide for it. In verse 11, but its swamps and its marshes will be, swamps and marshes are full of gas because things are dying and corroding and whatever they call that process in science. One great thing about being a pastor, I only had to take one science class and I just had to get a C. You know what I'm saying? And science was not my strength. But whatever happens in all that, the swamps are a place where dead stuff and just a little bit of life is. But it says here that the swamps are going to be transformed. The marshes are going to be transformed. They'll become fresh. All that stuff will be wiped away. All the stuff that is bad is going to be taken away. And they'll be left for salt. By the river of its banks, verse 12, on one side and on the other will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will wither, and their fruit will not fail. They will bear every month. Church, you hear me? Those things that stand in the path of that living water, that Jesus saving grace that comes out of the temple, everything that stands next to it will bear fruit monthly. You tell me, how do I really know when I'm walking in the way of the Lord? It'll be because you bear fruit monthly. And I'm not talking about just one fruit a month. I'm talking about those kind of fruit trees that you can call your neighbors to come get some. I've got so much happening here. You need to come get some of this fruit because I'll never get through it all. It's just coming out. It's coming on. Verse 12, they will bear every month because their waters flow from the sanctuary, and their fruit will be for food and their leaves for healing. There won't be a thing wasted on the side of that river where God's precious life-giving flow is happening. The fruit will be eaten. The leaves will be healing. They'll be medicinal for people. Why? Think about what that means. We're going to fulfill the hunger in people that are hungry. What are they really hungry for? It's not just a meal. Because we can be honest here tonight with each other. We're just this family. I'm hungry all the time. It's not the physical hunger that we're talking about here. It's a hunger for truth, hunger for change, hunger for life. And God says if you're bearing fruit, you're going to fulfill that hunger by His power. And it wasn't just that, but aren't there people in our community that are hurting? The Bible says that you, those things that live along the flow of that precious life-saving salvation. When your people begin to, when us people begin to be and understand our role, we're going to be able to provide healing for them. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that we're going to lay hands on people and they'll be healed. But let me tell you this. And this is a Baptist preacher who's very denominationally tied. It says this. When my own children were sick as an infant, when Josh was sick in the hospital, We lay hands on that little man. I'm just telling you, my God is bigger than any taboo of the church. My God is bigger. So I'm telling you this now. We're going to go out there and trust in our Father. We're going to go out there and trust in Him to do things. Because He's still the source of life. He is still flowing out from the temple into us. He's still pouring life into us. And if you're not receiving and bearing fruit, if you're not being used of God, it's not because God has gone anywhere. It's not because God is dead, as some people would say in philosophy. It's because you're not near the source of water. You're not near the source of life. And if you want to go out there and know this, if you want to go out there and try me, you come on in here and get in that deep water. It's dangerous, by the way. There's this really cool show. I got to find an illustration. C.S. Lewis. There's a book. Many of you probably read the book. Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. And remember that movie? How many of you have seen the movie? Probably very few of you. Okay. We're going to have to show it here sometime. It is way cool. And the book is even better. But in that, there's this point where Susie, I think that's the little girl's name, right? My kids can all quote her word for word, is questioning Mr. and Mrs. Beaver about the lion, Absalom. Interesting, right? We all know who the lion in the movie is, right? The Lion of Judah, the Bible calls Jesus. So she's obviously fearful of this lion. She's intimidated because when she sees this lion, he growls and he's huge and he's scary. She's just this little bitty thing. But in this, he asked Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, he says, about the lion, he says, is he dangerous? Anybody remember this part? He says about the lion, he says, is he dangerous? And Mrs. Beaver says, oh dear, yes, he's very dangerous. But he is also very good. And I'm telling you today, walking with Jesus isn't for the faint of heart. It's what I said in our men's prayer breakfast to a number of people. True men come out praying for the public. They come out and they pray before the Lord. They come out and they prayer walk their church. They weep prayer for their brothers and sisters. That's what real people do. True women lift up their church in its time of need. They go out and they minister when they're tired. Why? Because it's hard work. Only if you can do it. But let me tell you this. It's fearful to work with God. Can I just be honest with you? But man, it's also good. There wasn't a time on a mission trip anywhere where I wasn't tired at some point in the day. Whatever mission trip I went to in my life. But in all of it, I loved doing the work because I knew God was going to do something. And we're going to get weary before that pile of names and phone numbers is reached. We're going to get tired. But know this, the fear of doing the work, for me at least, and I hope for all of you, is far less important than it is the fear of not doing it. My Lord. Turn with me to chapter 48. Just want to take you to the very last verse, verse 35. Between 48, verse 1, and 48, verse 34, you see exact and precise measurements of the allotment of the land as they go back into the area. This tribe and this people are going to get this. The priests are going to get this. You can go back and read that if you want tonight. It's tough, and this is why I say it's a very tough passage to read. But in all of this, it's important because we see the promise of God beginning to come about as God re-gifts them the land. Their hope is restored. And we know that He tells them to build the temple because we've been studying in Haggai, and it's the same situation. We know that the wall is built because you read about that, I think, in Nehemiah. But here today, in verse 35 of chapter 48, look what it says. Excuse me. The city shall be 18,000 cubits round about. And the name of the city from that day shall be, the Lord is there. Let me tell you something tonight that I know and I believe most of you know. But if you don't, hear this. If you're having trouble in your marriage, The Lord is there. You just got to reach out to Him. You just got to cry out to Him. That water's flowing right from the temple, bringing life to you. If you're having trouble in your family, understand that God is there. If you're having trouble in your workplace, understand that God is there. If you're having trouble because you don't have a workplace, know God is there. If you're having trouble because you're looking for a different workplace, you got to know God is there. If you're having trouble with your friendships and relationships, God is there. If you're having trouble with your church, God is there. If you're having trouble with peers, friends, whatever the case may be, know that God is there. Jehovah-Shammah. The Lord is there. He said, no longer will Jerusalem be known as by that name. You just need to know that God is there. Call this area God is there. Because when you get back to build the temple, and when you get back to build the wall, and you're weary, know that my life-giving force is going to be flowing to you and through you. And if you'll just trust me and recognize it for what it is, you will be well equipped to do the job I've called you to do. How great a promise is that? You know, we look around and we say we still have open seats. We have evangelism ministry to do. We raise X amount of money a day for teenagers. Let me tell you something. I pray every day from this point until the summer of next year that God would produce so many students that would just be a drop in the bucket towards the cost of our camp. And I say, God, if you want them kids here, you'll provide the means to go to. Do you believe that a church this size used to send 8 kids to camp and not 20? God will provide. God will provide. Because that flowing water brings life where there wasn't life before. How exciting is that? If you don't go home fired up about God's promise that Jehovah-Shammah, that God is there, if you don't go home, by the way, when you go home, just remember that God is there. That God is there. When you go to work tomorrow, just remember that God is there. If you wake up with a headache in the morning or you're sick in the morning, know that God is there. He'll get you through. If you got problems, situations I haven't mentioned, just know this, God is there. He told the people of Israel through his prophet Ezekiel that same thing. Because they needed to hear that they had not been abandoned. They had forgotten the work that he had done in their ancestors. And they were looking for a reason to put their trust in something else. In that time, God raised up Ezekiel to go and tell them. So the second part of this is, if you know that God is there, you probably know someone that doesn't believe that. And let's spend this week praying. Because I believe prayer will go a lot farther in moving people to God than any 10 words I'm going to say. I'm going to get on my knees this week and I'm going to pray for so-and-so. Because I know they need to know God is there. How wonderful would it be if the person you prayed for all week came to church and got saved? Would that not be amazing? And I tell you this, oftentimes that doesn't happen. And one of the reasons why it doesn't happen is because we never stop praying for them. But if God is there in the midst of that situation, doesn't he already know? What is your role with him? I'm just going to get in the way of that living water. I'm going to soak it all up. And let God decide what to do with me as I bear fruit for him. That's my plan for this week. So now you know my plan. I pray that there's someone to say, all right, guys, close your eyes with me. How many of you would just, and that's about eyes closed, how many of you would go or would be willing to just raise your hands or just look up at me and say, I'm struggling to believe that God is there? How many would do that? I know it's a tough thing to say or admit to. But if you're that person, if you're just struggling to deal with that, I understand because I've been where you're at. And I'm certain there will be a time in the future where I'm struggling again. And I'm going to want someone to reach their hand out to me and say, hey, Curt, God is there. So if you're the one, if you raise your hand, or you're the 10 that raised your hand or looked up at me, let me just assure you of this. God is there. And I'm going to pray for you. If you need a specific prayer, You can go to our church website and you can write in directly to my email address. Click on curtrainey@gmail.com and you can tell me what it is and I'll pray specific for it. If you want me to put some prayer partners on it, I'll do that too. You direct me. But I tell you this tonight, God is there. You can trust Him because He's proven Himself to be there so many times. Heavenly Father, be with us tonight, Lord. I pray that you would move us beyond ourselves, Father. Take us to the place where we can once again see the flowing water that comes from the source of life, and that's you, Father. Take us to a place where we can once again experience that life-flowing promise that we're going to again be able to bear fruit. Maybe some of us in here feel like those dead trees and dead fish and a dead sea. We just feel like there's nothing good in us. Father, I pray that we would recognize that the good thing in us is flowing through us is you. And that as we move forward this week, Father, that you would give us opportunity to share the same message. Lord, that we would just pronounce that our God is there. Where we go, He'll already be there. Where we are, He's there. Where we've been, He's there. What a promise it is that you've given us, God, about you. I thank you, Lord, for your love in my life. I thank you for loving me. Father, I pray that as we move forward this week, you would help us to remember that as we deal with others. Maybe they're not ready to hear the truth or see it the way we do. Maybe they're seeing it better than us. Father, give us a compassion for one another, that we would see them through your eyes, the way you see them. Not in their present state, but in their perfected state in you. How beautiful would they must look. Guide us and direct us as we go forth tonight, Lord. Give us opportunity to evangelize for your great name. But most of all, we just thank you, Father, for your promises in Scripture. You're continuing to reveal yourself in different ways to us. It is so exciting to study. In Jesus' name I pray these things. Amen.